forward. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, a couple words of introduction. Number one, next week will be a Bible study, so bring your Bibles. If anybody is interested, I'm going to put in an order for Lutheran Bibles this week, the Lutheran Study Bible. Let me know. They're $20 each. Well, they're $25, but Hope University always kicks in $5 toward it. So, or if you want the super deluxe version that you can hardly carry and you have to have a cart, Sue has a sample up here. This is the large print one right here. Those are $49.95. My wife thinks it's worth it too. I think it's just as good to get this one and go to Walmart and buy a 95-cent magnifier that you can then read. That's the problem. But this is the one I use, and that's the one that is the same thing, but in leatherback or whatever. So if you'd like a copy, tell Sue afterwards, and we're going to order them.
Do they come in a large print version?
That's what this is.
So
Just
you have to get the big one.
costs a few more bucks. Yeah. Okay. So next week will be a straight Bible study on like the 19th, 20th, 21st, and 22nd chapters of the book of Revelation. And I'll take you to those chapters very quickly because they're the final chapters of the book of Revelation. As I said last night, and this is not a commercial, but if you're interested in the rest of the book of Revelation and what it says, there is a book for sale up here written by a good author, and they're just $10. So, and $1 of that goes to world hunger every time. Okay, today we're going to talk about, I was going to talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls and Jesus, which I'm still going to talk about. But how many think they could stand up right now and tell me all about the Dead Sea Scrolls? So I thought I'd be far better off giving a nice introduction to the Dead Sea Scrolls so you know what they are, when they were found, who found them, and how they can be used. We'll follow that up then with how it relates to Jesus. There's a couple points in the middle that tell us how it can be done, but at the end I will do the part where it relates to Jesus and what it has to say. So I'm giving you an introduction to the Dead Sea Scrolls and their relation to Jesus' ministry at the end. So the reason you don't have outlines today is that every time I put a picture up there of something like that, it comes out as a little square like that on the outline and takes up about that much space. And I do settle back, be relaxed. I do have a total of almost 80 slides today. So you'll get to see Dead Sea Scrolls. There's the land down along the Jordan River, east of Jericho, probably fairly close to where John baptized Jesus. And just an overview, forget about the train that's running through there, but that's an overview of how it's really a barren place. But it was shepherds who were grazing their flocks, throwing stones. Suppose this is the most common theory, that they were throwing stones into caves. It's the land there is like tufa rock. Does anybody know what tufa rock is? If you come from northwestern Ohio, it's very porous, very light, and so there are many caves carved out of this on the basis of rain when they do get it. But supposedly there's a shepherd there, and he threw a stone into the cave, and he heard the sound of breaking pottery. Or another theory that's just developed in the last few years by one scholar who said one of the shepherd's dogs fell into a hole. And so when they went down in the hole, which is like a cave, they found the dog, of course, and found the first of the Dead Sea Scrolls, or some other tale of speculation. This we know. There were three cousins who were Bedouin shepherds. There gives you a little bit of picture of the countryside. And what they found, and ultimately I'll tell you what they did with them, the oldest group of Old Testament manuscripts ever found. It precedes any Jewish manuscript used for a translation of the Bible, like our Old Testament, by at least 1,000 years. So when you see how much older they are, you begin to learn they must have some importance in biblical studies. They were discovered in either late 1946 or 47. And there's history I'm going to show you in a minute that we go through, because by 1955, 8 years later, they had discovered 9 more caves. And what led them and motivated them is what motivates most people in the world, called money. And they found out that once they sold them to someone, he in turn sold them for $250,000 back in 1952 or 53. So you begin to realize that these have value. The contents, at least 1,000 years older than the traditional Hebrew text used as a basis of modern translations, such as any one of the Bibles that you have that has an Old Testament and a New Testament. The Old Testament was translated by Hebrew scholars. And these scholars were using now much of what the Dead Sea Scrolls has to offer us, as opposed to what the Jewish line of religion felt were the mainstays of their beliefs. Now, much of what's there is identical to what's in our Bible, but even the Jewish scholars have made some changes. Some of them agree with the Greek Septuagint. Does anybody know what the Greek Septuagint is? It's the Greek translation of the Old Testament. So we call that the Septuagint. Had to take a whole course in that. The total number of scrolls that we now try to count, if they are intact, and we'll show you how they get there, numbers about 1,000. It's actually 930 or 940. So they've identified the remains of at least 900 scrolls. Most are bits and pieces. You can imagine dealing with scrolls that are 2,000 years old. You don't just open them and read them, folks. They're either on papyrus or on, it'll come to me, or there is one copper scroll, papyrus or animal skin. How's that? No, it's not leather. It's like leather, Marilyn, but it's the back part. It'll come to me, don't worry. Parchment. There it is. Okay. Ding dong. Lights are on, but nobody's home. One cave. It said they discovered 9 caves. Actually, the total is now 11. But one cave, number 4, contained an estimated 15,000 fragments. Some in jars, some laying around on the floor. You never knew where you were going to find them up on shelves, and we'll explain why that is. Of all those scrolls, let's say 900, biblical scrolls, exact translations that were shared among this Qumran community, make up 1/4 are biblical in nature. Now, some of the others talk about the Bible groups. They're called apocryphons. But as far as translations that we would use, 1/4, 130. Now, here's what's interesting. Of all those that were found, how many books in the Old Testament? 39. Of all that were found, we have some copies of at least 28 of them, except for Esther. Now, that wasn't sexist in nature. Probably, we don't know. Esther is totally about the festival of Purim. And the writers of the Dead Sea Scrolls never mention Purim. So that could be why it's left out. Now, non-biblically, here are just some. There are rules of the community, lots of rules that the community had to follow. And those are in many ways related to Deuteronomy. They have a war scroll in case they're attacked, what they should do, and all that came true. And the copper scroll of all 900 and some, there's one copper scroll. They're still not able or desirous of trying to unroll it. However, with new ultra-red, ultrasonic instruments, it's a whole new, got a long name like that, they are able to see through one cover to see what's in the next roll underneath. So at least we're a little ways into that scroll. Now, here, let's talk about the original 7. The original 7, which the Bedouins found, were sold off in 2 lots. I mean, what's a shepherd going to do with scrolls? So they sell them off. The discovery was announced on April 11th, 1948. Does anybody know what happened on that day? That's the day that the United Nations statement separated into a country of Israel as opposed to a kingdom of Britain. The British left on that day. It might have some relationship later on, but not very much. Okay, the original 7 scrolls included these books: the Manual of Discipline, the Tale of the Patriarchs, which is kind of surprising because not many of the scrolls talk about Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and so on. That's more about their discipline and what they followed. Thanksgiving hymns, which are psalms. They've now, the greatest, last month, I believe they found Psalm 151. So if you know that there are 150 psalms in the Bible, they now think they have 151. A commentary on Habakkuk, an Old Testament prophet who lived at the time after the people returned from Babylonia to Judah from captivity. The War Scroll, and this becomes important, 2 copies of the book of Isaiah. And you'll see as we go on why that's important. I said last night, one thing about studying the Dead Sea Scrolls or teaching the Dead Sea Scrolls is you open one door and there are 3 doors or 4 doors in front of you. And you have to choose one of them, and they all have a theory. And all the theories sound good. So you choose one, and you go through that, and there's a couple more to go after that. And it just keeps on like that. You could read forever on the Dead Sea Scrolls. Or, if you want, you can read the Dead Sea Scrolls themselves, and that's how thick the book is, which shows where there are gaps and all of that. Okay, the Dead Sea. Dead Sea is home to the Qumran community, part of it. There could have been other communities there too. But it's also home to Masada. Many of you have probably heard about Masada. Now there's a difference between Masada and Qumran, and we'll point that out. There may be some connection. They're still speculating, but I don't think there's any connection between the two. Why? Because the Qumran community was a religious community. It was a commune where they shared, they ate together, they did everything together. Masada was a fortress. I call it King Herod's Camp David. It's where King Herod could go away and be protected if Jerusalem was ever attacked by anyone. So he built this fortress that's now called Masada. They're about 40 miles apart. I'm going to show you in a minute. Purposes were entirely different. So here's a map. It's a little hard to read, but it's the best one to show us where that little tiny square up there by the Q, that's Qumran, overlooking the Dead Sea. This spot just south of there, less than a mile, are caves number 4 through 10, and they're listed in the order in which they were discovered. Caves 1 and 2 are north of Qumran, and caves 3 and 11 are probably about 3 miles away at most, closer to 2. These are other sites where manuscripts have been discovered, and Masada is way down here. So there you see the difference. Here's your legend. So it's about 40 miles. We'll bring that back up in a minute. There's the Dead Sea at low tide. When the Dead Sea is relatively dry, you begin to see the salinity of it. And this is a point at which it's getting pretty dry. Now, of course, those buildings were not there at the time. You understand? The Qumran site, it may have looked like this before it was excavated, and it was inhabited by people sometime around 175 BC until we know exactly 68 AD. 175 to 150. I would lean more toward 150, but some other scholars think it's closer to 175. Probably inhabited by an Essene community, and we'll talk about who are the Essenes in a minute. Was John the Baptist an Essene? Many scholars have believed over the years that he was Essene. The reason being that he took the vow of poverty, that he used baptism, only his baptism was a little different than what they did at Qumran, but he looked like he belonged. How else can we say it? So if John the Baptist was an Essene, that would lead to a Jesus connection. Now, he could have been an Essene and not lived in Qumran. There were other small developments of Essenes. So that's how it could have looked when they found it. Rough, but still very much intact. And there are nearby caves to Qumran. Now, caves may have been used by the community when the Romans began their destruction up the Jordan in AD 68. The community of people probably heard of other destruction of nearby cities in 66 and 67. We'll show you why we know it's 68 in just a minute. How do we know that it ceased to exist in 68? Coinage really backs up that view. In other words, as the tools of archaeology are a paintbrush at best, and sometimes you use even a finer brush as you carefully get out some of the heavy dust and stuff that's on top. And then when you begin getting to anything that's of value, you're going to just use your brush to brush it off and see what it is. They did find a pottery with some coinage in it. And in checking, anybody a coin numismatist in here? Okay. I used to be one. But numismatists, when you study coins, you're looking at their age. And they were able to discover that there were quite a few 66 AD coins. There were relatively few 67 coins. And there were no AD 68 coins. So out of this common pottery where many coins were found, that's what they discovered. Josephus, who is a great Jewish theologian writer, right around the time of Jesus, and he gives us a lot of insight into Jesus. He tells us that Jericho, very close, I'm going to put the map up again, very close to Qumran, was destroyed in AD 68. And in hearing of the destruction, the Essenes probably began to stash away their library. They were literary people. I'll have a slide in a minute showing the scriptorium, where however many, what should I call them, monks, however many Essenes inhabited the confines of Qumran. In that community, there was a room that they're pretty sure where the translations, the dictations took place. In other words, it's as if you never heard the Gospel of John, but you're all there ready with your pencils and paper, and I'm reading it. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So we come up with multiple copies of some of the scrolls, as I'll list them in a little bit. But there are some caves. Gives you an idea of what that territory looked like. These I put up here because they're fairly distinctive where the caves might be. There are areas that have even more caves. There's one from the outside. That's where a dog might have fallen. And that's from that cave looking out. Okay, inside the caves, they found some pottery that was intact, and over 900 manuscripts discovered in 11 caves. You can understand that when the 7 original scrolls were made public, now they weren't totally made public, as you'll find out later, but parts of them were made public, that scholars rushed to get there. They rushed to get there simply because this was a great find. And they may have done some good, they may have not done some good. They might have brushed stuff aside that needed to be saved and looked at. But they found 2 more caves. One French-led group found 2 more caves. And people are still looking in some of the many caves that are there. Occasionally, by occasionally, should I say once a year, twice a year, they'll find a little fragment of paper or whatever it is and bring it back. The Bedouins, the shepherds, have now become a hunting group because they know there's lots of money in that. Many of those manuscripts are written in Hebrew and Greek, Greek being the language of the New Testament, Hebrew being the language of the Old Testament. And in a scriptorium at the Qumran site is where they were written, and about 13% of all that were found are written in Aramaic, which was the spoken language of Jesus. We are going to study, this is what, September? as we think of the blocks. In November, I'll be teaching a course on Matthew, which we believe Matthew in many ways might have been originally written in Aramaic. But this again is where we make a connection with Jesus. Not big, but it's a connection. Of the 900 manuscripts, not all were from the Qumran community. Some are a little older and can be dated from the 3rd century BC and were probably carried into the community by the people who were interested in being Essenes. So there we have again, and you see how close the Qumran community is to Jericho, maybe 8 miles north, and Jerusalem about 15 miles west. And so that puts them in that spot that is a religious spot. And you see the Jordan River coming down, and we do think there was somewhere around Jericho, give or take 10 miles, that John the Baptist did his baptizing. Okay, let me give you an example of a connection. The scroll that is called the Apocryphon of Daniel. Remember, apocryphons kind of like commentaries or the extension of stories that we don't have in the Bible. They kind of, I don't want to say made up stories, but that's part of the Apocryphon. The Apocryphon of Daniel, and I'll tell you about the numbers later, written in Aramaic, at least 100 years before the Gospel of Luke. Luke was probably written in 80 AD, 75 AD. Says, and this is a quotation, a future ruler will be called great, and by his name he will be designated. The Son of God, he will be proclaimed, and the Son of the Most High, they will call him. What does it mean that he will be designated by his name? What does Jesus mean? One who saves. So you can put that together. That's in the Apocryphon of Daniel from the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now let's look in the New Testament, in the Gospel of Luke. The angel appears to Mary and says that her son will be called Son of the Most High and Son of God. So you can take that last sentence right out of there and see how close they are. Okay, identifying the scrolls. Once the fragment is identified, it is placed on a piece of glass and photographed. Now let's just imagine you got 15 to 17,000 fragments found in cave number 4. It's almost like you could think of shoveling them out. I think they were a little more careful than that, but in some cases maybe not. Each is given a Q number, which means it's from Qumran. And the number identifies the cave from which it came. Then it's given a number to show its location, either in the stack that you're looking at or where it was located in the cave. So you might end up with something like 4Q, that's the 4th cave of Qumran, and it's the 235th sheet or page. Now, various translations, if you ever are reading or interested in reading, might say 4QS. S stands for Syriac, meaning the Hebrew word that says this is in order. It's not just the 235th fragment found, this is the order it goes in. So you could end up with, for instance, cave number 4, Qumran, 235 would be the scroll, fragment number 4 through 6, and column 1. That's only if you're really into this stuff. It's all right here. Anybody wants to borrow my Dead Sea Scrolls can. Dorothy?
How many years did it take for these scholars to start and finish with what we have now?
we'll hope that we get there by the end of today. I guess I'm saying hang in there with me, because it's complicated. It's complicated. Okay, there's some more bigger caves. And understand, as we need to know this as we read the New Testament, that there are three Jewish schools of philosophy. The first one is the Pharisees. Jesus has some set twos with the Pharisees, does he not? And the Pharisees were lay people, and they believed in the resurrection. The second group are the Sadducees. They were the priestly group, and they did not believe in the resurrection. Then we see why it's significant that at Jesus' death, trial and death, the Pharisees and the Sadducees come together and begin talking with each other. It's like if we would start talking with Missouri Synod, that was a bad illustration. But if we started talking with someone who had a major belief difference from us, as they did, it happens at Jesus' death. Then you have the Essenes, a much smaller group than those others. They believed in a separation of body and soul. So you have one believing in the resurrection, one not believing in the resurrection, one believing in the separation of body and soul. Okay, we have to prove that there was a community there in Qumran. If we're going to make something out of what they did, most people feel that the Qumran site was the central headquarters of the Essene movement and the main dwelling place of the teacher and his disciples. We'll talk about the teacher in just a little bit. See what I'm talking about? You open one door and you got another door to go through. Probably happened after their rejection by the Pharisees and Sadducees. That they went out and said, let's go out and start our own community. So here's the nature of the Essenes. They ate together, they studied together, they worshiped together, and most importantly, they shared all their property to create the community, to feed themselves, and all was a shared property. That's all spelled out in the Manual of Discipline, which is one of the first 7 scrolls found. They have found numerous copies of it. Like the Essenes, the Christians of Acts of the Apostles, chapter 2 through 4, practice a community of goods, a community of bringing your wealth into making a common pot from which you could follow. You know, we sometimes think that because so many were converted on Pentecost and were baptized, that the Christian church must say, man, we're big, we got 1,000 people. It didn't quite happen that way. Many were, brought to light, but by and large, the early Christian community in its various cities, let's just put the early Christian community in Jerusalem, probably numbered 30 to 40. And then you could go up to Nazareth, you go over to Sea of Galilee, and there'd be small groups in each city. Thus, they were the only 2 groups to have known to have done this, the Essenes and the Christians. Another little insight. And we talked about the teacher of righteousness, going out and being the leader of the community. Apparently, the teacher of righteousness was the founder of the Essene community at Qumran. He was a priest, exceptionally gifted in religious insight, believed to have been granted special revelations from God about the true meaning of Scripture and the proper interpretation of the law of Moses. And so you find a heavy emphasis in the scrolls on the book of Deuteronomy. Marilyn.
Was Mary on a scene?
Was Mary in the scene? I have no idea. I have no idea. Mary was probably just a young Jewish girl. No more, no less. We would not assign her a theology. We wouldn't say she was a Pharisee or she was a Sadducee. But being a lay person, probably was a Pharisee. But on the other hand, you've got to put her connection in there with being related to John the Baptist and his family, and that father, of course, was a priest. So you get a little bit of both. Now the founder, the teacher of righteousness, is opposed by the man of the lie. This gives us an indication of where we in the Christian church talk about dualism, good and bad, good and evil. Or you can go down past that and go into some of the other opposites that are used, for instance, in the Gospel of John, light and darkness. You know, you who were in darkness have now seen the great light in the Gospel of John. There's stuff like that in Dead Sea Scrolls, in abundance. Their theology was very dualistic. It was also contrasting good and bad. It was also apocalyptic, which is a study of the last times. And it was eschatological, which is how do you get to the last times? You are now living in the eschaton. He tried to dissuade many, and we're talking about real people here, from submitting to the teacher's ideas. And we pick that up from some of the scratches that go on in the papyrus and in the parchment. Here's an overhead view of the community. I'm going to show you some close-ups here in a minute, but this is an overhead view, and keep in mind that you're going to see one of these rooms. This one is possibly the scriptorium, and we'll show you why we believe it was. And the fortress is over here, but it's a very advanced community for that time and place. Here's how it looks almost at ground level. Now you can't, I wish we could put a person in there to show you what this is, but you could probably, in that space, you could probably get 40 people standing up. What?
What is this?
This is Qumran, where the Essenes were. Now, we also discovered, anybody know what these things are called?
Yeah.
Those are mikvahs. Mikvahs. M-I-K-V-E-T. V-E-W, I guess, in English. They are, the Jewish community went through baptismal rites to enter the community. And there are many of these, 4 or 5 of them, within that walled city of Qumran. Here's another one right there. It's part of confession and forgiveness, being clean. You have, before you ever go to confession, and a part of the whole ritual of the Essene community, which was a rigid discipline. The Jews would also suggest that you have a ritual bath before you go into the temple. They were so advanced. I've got other slides to show this, but I just want to show it. They were so advanced that they had their own sewer system. Seriously, had a very complicated sewer system, as you would need with people living there. Okay, here are the coins that were found. And this was the real cache. This was the pantry. Do you see all the bowls? This is an archaeological stick that's 1, 2, 3, 4, probably 5 feet long. These might be in centimeters instead of inches, but you use these sticks in study archaeology just to get an idea of what kind of space we're talking about. So this was probably the pantry. Over 200 bowls were found. So therefore, scholars believe they could feed up to 200 people. Was like, you know, I use my bowl every day for breakfast, and I put it in the dishwasher, and about 4 days later, we run the dishwasher. But they found this hoard, this cache of bowls and cups. Now, much of it broken because of age, 2,000 years old. Maybe the Romans didn't want anything to do with it, and so that is what but I don't think they destroyed it. Okay, so here's how the community looks. The courtyard is believed where many of the people gathered. To be in a scene, you had to go through a year-long process. And so the courtyard is where people could gather, and in the court to be taught. Every one of these rectangular blue things is a cistern, so that they were assured of a water supply. Here's the pantry down here, and they probably ate in the assembly hall. Talk about numbers in a minute. Over here is questionably the library. And next to the library would be a storage room. Now, how many Essenes were there? That becomes a great question of many people. How many Essenes lived in Qumran? We think maybe as many as 100 to 150 people lived in this enclave. Now, it's also thought that there were many others who would camp out around it as they did their year probation, if we call it that, to prepare to go in. Why do we think so many more? Because Qumran also has a cemetery. And in the cemetery, there are hundreds of graves. Now, you're talking about a period of maybe 200 years, but there are hundreds of graves. Yes, Cora. Judy's got the microphone.
That's all right, I can talk louder. The blue areas, what did you say they were on the map?
The blue area, cisterns, that's where they stored their water.
Oh, okay, thank you.
And then, of course, it goes around. Ultimately, it comes out down here. Notice the baths are the last place where it comes. This is where the pottery ruin was found, even though that's the pantry over there. But it's away from the cisterns and the water. This jagged line you see going through there is a result of an earthquake that happened in 30 BC, 31 BC. Kind of split things up a little bit at that point. Yes?
Was this the only community of Essenes, or were there little communities like Qumran all over the place? And what happened to if they
Okay.
were adding people to the Essenes, they couldn't all live there?
Right.
Where did they go? Did they spread out all over the place?
Okay. Everybody hear that question? This was not the only community of Essenes, but it was the major community, thought to be and been started by the teacher of righteousness. As people went through their probation and became Essenes, they may have just continued to tent out until a place opened up because of death or something. Or maybe 3 or 4 of them would go out somewhere within another community. We do not know of any other Qumran type Essene communities. Good question. Okay, here's the main assembly hall where they could have come together. Again, I wish I had people sitting in there so you could see their size. This is another gathering hall, which might have been, quote, a dormitory. We're uncertain. And I talk like I've been there. I haven't been there. They found as they were digging up, they did not find within the Essene community any written materials. They were all in the caves. But they did find some ink wells. This one in the middle happens to be metallic. Those two are pottery on the outside. Now, if you're looking at centimeters here, you're looking at best at maybe 2 inches across. And maybe they use feather pens. I don't know what kind of pens they use. Okay, let's look at the history now. Who discovered these and what happened to them and how do they come to us today? 3 Bedouin cousins were grazing their sheep. One threw a stone and heard pottery break. He didn't immediately go and investigate, but the next day he pointed out to his cousins, I heard something break in there. So they went in and they investigated. They sold the original that they found. Actually, it was 4 that they found first, then they found 3 later. They sold them to an antique dealer who sold the original 4 in 2 lots. So, what they found really in cave 1, 8 jars, 6 were empty, 1 had dirt at the bottom, and the other contained 2 scrolls. Later identified as the Book of Isaiah and the Manual of Discipline. The Manual of Discipline is very important to their life. So they later returned and found 5 more. They hadn't done anything with those 2 yet. These are 2 of the cousins. The 3rd guy didn't like to have his picture taken. And one of my weak moments when I was trying to sleep the other night and think about this was, how did I ever get that photograph of those guys who were there 2,000 years ago? Yeah. Really, we're talking about pictures taken about 1950. And then there's another character who gets involved by the name of Kando. He was a wholesaler in antiquities in Jerusalem. They were already gathering antiquities. I didn't do nothing. He in turn sold 4 of the 7 to a Syrian Orthodox metropolitan. A metropolitan in the Orthodox Church is the same as a bishop in a Catholic or a Lutheran church. But he sold the other 3 to Eleazar Sukenek. And he was a professor at Hebrew University who studied antiquities. So the Orthodox metropolitan decided maybe the church needs a little money, and so he sold the 4 to a man named Yadim, who was the son-in-law of Sukenek. Now, ask yourself where you think he sold these. What was the site of selling them? Just hold that in your mind for a minute. All 7 now were in one individual's hands. There's the Metropolitan. There's Cando. And there, from the Wall Street Journal, is the ad that said biblical manuscripts dating back to at least 200 BC are for sale. Be an ideal gift for an institution or a religious institution, educational, by an individual or group. So it'd be good if you'd buy these. Just happened that Yadim was in New York at the time this ad was in the Wall Street Journal. You talk about the providence of God, that it was there that it happened. And then he takes him back to his father-in-law, who now possesses all 7 of the original. What did they look like? Oftentimes, there were jars, tin jars, at least 2 feet high, that we have found intact, over 17,000 scraps. We're talking pieces like this, pieces maybe like that. Some were strewn on the cave floors. Portions of nearly 1,000 manuscripts, we already said 930 or 940, written on parchment and papyrus, and 1 copper scroll. And the copper scroll is still believed to contain directions to where the temple treasury was hidden from the Romans before the Romans overtook Jerusalem in 70 AD. And so you see how these dates line up together. And they've, by going through the first roll, the first, whatever you call it, first time around the metal scroll, copper scroll, and now being able to see through to the next level, they haven't changed their minds. They still think that it's directions to where the temple riches were hidden. So you have items like this that were found, at least 10 of them, and some of them were books that were intact. We have 2 complete books of the prophet Isaiah in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Some of them can be unrolled. Now you have to understand, you don't go and say, let me see what it says. We're talking about painstakingly, minimalistic unrolling, 1/8 of an inch at a time. And it's all done in humidity, climate-controlled vault, so that these things are all safe. But that's one of the better ones. Here shows you some pieces. What happens, all the time these are connected together, but there are holes. Hey, they were in caves for 2,000 years. There were bats in those caves. There were rats in those caves. There were all kinds of things that could get in there. Maybe some water seeped in and a piece of it rotted or something like that. And so you get, I'm going from the best to ultimately you'll see the worst. There, something ate away the whole bottom. So when and this is Hebrew, scholars read it right to left, top to bottom. And so as they would read it right to left, they deciphered and speculated what might be in there on the basis of what's over here. There's one that's eaten away at the top, and you can see the top of the scroll over here. But it's painstaking. We're talking months and years to unroll these. This is a picture of the copper scroll, and it has not been unrolled. There is a piece that came off down there, and those are ones that they work with. Okay, how many altogether? Where are they located today? The Bedouin found 7 altogether in cave number 1. The first 3, Book of Isaiah, Manual of Discipline, a commentary on the prophecy of Habakkuk. Next 4 were a collection of Psalms, another partial copy of Isaiah, the War Scroll, and the Genesis Apocryphon, stories based upon some of the narratives in Genesis. So if you want to know what happened to Noah when he was out there in the boat on the Dead Sea, were there any storms or anything like that, you might find it there. They used their imagination. Okay, how were they authenticated? Now, first of all, great professors became involved immediately, and they identify them and their value and began to announce their finds. Note they didn't publish their finds. They announced that they had found such and such. This is 1948. Archaeological dating. How do we date these items? We date them, first of all, by coins, as we saw, the jar of coins, and by history, looking back at the other writings, not the biblical writings, but the other 700 writings that were discovered, and seeing what kings they refer to and who was the governor, and that way the historians can put all that together. They do a lot of handwriting comparison in placing. Okay, consider yourself, you're sitting there and we dump 17,000 fragments on your table. First thing you do is you ask about 30 other people to join you and do their part. But they can do handwriting comparisons the same way as we can do it today. They can do a carbon-14 test. A carbon-14 test has long been an archaeological tool. It's falling into some disuse, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But, everything has carbon within it, the atoms of carbon. And as it ages, the atoms float away, if you want to put it that way. So on the basis of how many are left, we can date something within 11 years. It's normally the way carbon-14 works. The new big help is infrared study. They can unroll a scroll or a piece of scroll that you couldn't read, I couldn't read, magnifying glass wouldn't help, anything like that. But there is a new machine that they can use that brings out the letters, And so that's really used effectively, in the last 5 to 6 years. Maybe longer, maybe 10 years. But now DNA can be used. How can DNA be used to date the scrolls? You all have different DNAs, every one of you. Every animal has different DNAs. So if they're writing on parchment, they put it to DNA test, have two pieces that they think go together, they can do a DNA test on each one of them and say, no, they don't fit. They don't have the same DNA. So then you put that one in that pile and this one on another pile. So that's the major ways on which archaeologically we can date this so accurately. Here's the room where some of the original work was done. This is in the Rockefeller Museum in Israel, Jerusalem. And you can see the pieces laid out that they've already put together. This was before DNA testing took place. It's an older photograph, but gives you an idea of the room where they worked. There's an example of trying to fit the pieces together, either by handwriting or by DNA. You can use carbon-14 on papyrus. Carbon-14 cannot be used on hard, permanent surfaces like pottery. But if you take a piece of cloth out of the pot, you can do a carbon-14 test on it. Here are just a few more pictures of what's been found. Much has been found. That's the copper scroll right there. Okay, what Bible scrolls are there? Now you see, now we're getting down to brass tacks. There are at least 20 scrolls that have a portion of Genesis or a large portion of Genesis. Maybe 21. One's questionable right now. Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. Look at Deuteronomy, where we get the law of Moses in Deuteronomy. Maybe 32, but we do have 30. Joshua, we have 3. Judges 4, 1 Samuel 4, Isaiah 21. You're going to see the significance, this and one other in a moment. Jeremiah, Ezekiel, 12 prophets, come all the way down till we look at Psalms. 34 different scrolls are either partially or fully filled with the Psalms. The only one we don't have, like I say, is Esther. So there's a total of 206 for sure that are related to our books of the Bible. This is a gathering room where they might have worshiped. This is what's thought to be the scriptorium. This ledge was higher, and the students could sit on the ledge, and they had, in the museum in Jerusalem, they have developed, and I didn't show you a picture of it because I don't think it's very good, of what the desks look like. But they felt they wrote on desks basically of stone and parchment. Okay, why do we think this was a library? On one wall is a cave, an opening. Now notice the shape of it. I'm going to give you a close-up. See, it's the same one, only there's this little tiny hole in there. So you could go in and say, I want to study such and such. These are all scholars, these people. I want to read such and such, study such and such. And you would be handed the scroll through that hole. That's how they kept you. You go to the library. When you were in high school, you went to the library, you took a book off the shelf, you better go to the librarian and get it checked out. This was the early things that happened to a library. This is the fortress at the corner to keep away any enemies. Of course, it didn't have the wooden steps going up there, but they do now. Okay. Like I say, you open one door, another door is back behind, and there's something there. There was a scandal about publishing the Dead Sea Scrolls. Remember, I said the scholars announced the finding, but they did not do any publishing back in 1950, 48, 50. So, discovered in 1947, they came under the auspices through Eleazar Sukenek given to the Jordanian Antiquities Association, because that part belonged to Jordan. Now, they were later transferred the next year, 48, to the Israeli Antiquities Authority, which still exists and is very prominent. Because now, 1948, Israel becomes a state, country, whatever. They took a team of their own scholars, 20 years, to publish the first manuscript. Unbelievable that it would take that long. It then took an enlarged team, because all the scholars in the world were clamoring to look at them. It took an enlarged team another 20 years to publish just 33 more. Now, if we got 930 manuscripts and 40 years go by, now you're up to about 1987. Actually, Herschel Shanks, who is the now retired editor, publisher of Biblical Archaeological Review, BAR. There are several thousand of us nationwide. It's over 100,000 belong to the Biblical Archaeological Society. If you belong to that society, you get a monthly magazine called Biblical Archaeological Review, which I read cover to cover. But he waited a few years. Shanks was the publisher of that. He got so interested in archaeology. By training, he was a lawyer. But at a young age, he took a trip to Israel, and that's where he really got interested in archaeology. So he, together with two others, threatened a lawsuit to make the Dead Sea Scrolls become public. They lost in court. But then they appealed, and the fine was lessened. But in order for the guy who was in charge of the group doing the translation to prove that he owned the copyright, or was his, had to bring forth many of the scrolls. So now they were public. And so Herschel Shanks, he's 87 years old now. He gets a lot of credit for this, what he did. Okay, where are they today? They're almost all in Jerusalem. A few are in Jordan. Some are in Europe, specifically Oxford, England, and the United States. So have any of you seen the display that goes around the country? They come from various places. Duke University, I know, has a small display that they can show. I saw some of the first ones before Shanks even came on the scene in 1965 in Washington Art Museum. They were there as a temporary display, and there were only 5 pieces. But you got to see them, and if you were arm in arm with a Hebrew student, I mean, I'm a New Testament scholar, so I read Greek, but if I were arm in arm with an Old Testament scholar, they could read those. It was our senior year of seminary, so the alphabet was still pretty clear at that point. So, the few that are in the shrine of the book in Jerusalem are accessible to everybody. They built this building called the Shrine of the Book. You'll see it in a minute. The majority are stored on campus of the Israel Museum in a small temperature, humidity-controlled vault. Any scholar can get permission to see them, to ask to see a particular item if they're preparing something for publication or for re-photography. They've all been photographed already. Now, numerous microfiche and complete photographic copies can be found in Huntington Library in San Marino, California. Some lady gave millions to be able to accumulate this. The Ancient Biblical Manuscript Center in Claremont, California. Hebrew Union College, which is a very exciting Jewish college and seminary in Cincinnati, and Oxford Center for Postgraduate Hebrew Studies in London. That is the Shrine of the Book in Jerusalem, built specifically to display. Here's what it looks like inside. Note, it's built in a way that it's all natural lighting. There are no lights that can take away the printing that is available on them. Now, I'm not showing my politics. I'm only showing the next picture to give you an idea how big that is up there. But there you see the size of some of, and that whole thing goes all the way around. Okay, now we're to where we're supposed to be at the beginning, right? Where does Jesus fit into all this? John the Baptist, yes, was probably an Essene. Everything we know about him leads us to believe that. The Essenes gave up their earthly wealth and lived in poverty and community. Now, 13% of 120, or about 120 texts out of the 900, are in the Aramaic language. And we have to start asking why. Well, these seem to be set in the time of the exile in Babylon. And the Israelites, when they were taken exile, they didn't take the whole country, but they took all the leaders and the scholars to Babylon. Babylonia spoke Aramaic, as did most of the Middle East at that point. And so there was that time when they would come back to rebuild the temple, 532 BC, 300 years before this, but still took them a long time to rebuild that temple, believe me. Read Ezra and Nehemiah and you'll get some idea how long it took. But you could also say, did Abraham speak Hebrew? He came from the Ur of the Chaldees, way up there along the Tigris and Euphrates. He didn't speak Hebrew. So what happened is Hebrew became the language of worship, Aramaic the language that we talk today, or they talked. We don't talk it. I don't anyway. Also, they were in the courts, hauled in the courts in Babylonia, and they would not have spoken Hebrew there. They would have spoken Aramaic. So, early Jewish apocalyptic material are often inscribed in Aramaic. So when we go to the Dead Sea Scrolls, apocalyptic literature, apocalypse is the end, the coming of the end. Daniel and Jubilees are two books that contain that. They are written in Aramaic. Why? Possibly to make them available to communities beyond Judea, including Jews who are living in the diaspora, up around Asia Minor, somewhere up around there. Okay, more. The big question, was Jesus influenced by the Essenes? There seems to be substantial overlap between the people of the scrolls and the early Christians in their ways of life and in their beliefs. The earliest followers of Jesus and the literature they produced were very Jewish in nature, not necessarily written in Hebrew, but it was Jewish in nature. The scrolls are the most significant body of Hebrew Aramaic literature related to a Jewish group from that time. And when I say from that time, I'm talking 300, 500 years. A fairly large amount of teaching in the scrolls was known and had been applied to New Testament study before 1947, so that they could talk about communal living, they could talk about coming together as Christians, things that the Essenes were later practiced. Okay, two parallels between the scrolls and the New Testament will illustrate this point. Number one is the ongoing nature of divine revelation. The age of revelation, as most Jews said at that time, did not end with the last book of the Old Testament. Malachi was not the last book of the Old Testament, according to Christians and to the Essenes. But to the rest of the Jews, yes. You and me, we're probably more Jewish than we thought. When we look at the influence the Essenes and the Jews had upon Christians. Members of both communities read Scripture eschatologically. In other words, you read a saying of Jesus in the Gospels that the kingdom of God is among you. You read that eschatologically. You read that, how does that apply to the future, now and to the future? So they're always pointing forward. Both groups anticipated messianic leadership. somewhere at the end of time. However, Christians talked about Jesus as the Messiah, and the Essenes talked about messiahs, plural. Here's an interesting illustration. In the Qumran text, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Festival of Weeks was probably the occasion for an annual covenant renewal, and new members were received into the group. How many of you were Lutheran and were confirmed on Pentecost? Celebration of the Festival of the Weeks still continues to this day in some places. Okay, one more parallel. The three books which appear on the largest number of Qumran copies are also the three most quoted books in the New Testament. Look at them. Psalms, Deuteronomy, Isaiah. And as you read the Gospels, you will find Jesus quoting from those three more than any other book. And so it's also the largest number of copies. Remember, I showed you that whole list of what was there. So we're left with these questions, and you're going to be able to ask your questions in just a second. How well did Jesus know John the Baptist? They were cousins, right? Purely speculative, though. Living 70 miles apart. Jesus being raised in Nazareth, and Sepphoris next to Nazareth, doing all his ministry around the Sea of Galilee. Although Jesus is very upset when John the Baptist is beheaded. So how well did he know him? We don't know. Had John the Baptist ever been to Qumran if he wasn't a Essene? Can't answer that either. He didn't leave a daily diary. If John the Baptist was a part of an Essene group, not necessarily Qumran, did he influence Jesus' lifestyle and teaching? Jesus said, the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head, and Jesus was supported wherever he went to teach. Is the evidence of common thought and lifestyle enough to say Jesus was influenced by the Dead Sea Scrolls? That's kind of the key. So I just want to say, be prepared. Next week, we're going to look at eternal life, a study of the final chapters of the book of Revelation. One of my favorite pictures, that comes from Australia and outside of Sydney. You get to see the mountains. Any questions? Sue, here comes Judy with the phone. You'll never appear on television unless you...
Okay, so in the very beginning, there was something about 1,000 years before Hebrew written something, and I just got lost.
Oh, okay.
Never mind.
Yeah. Think of your Bible, the Old Testament. It's been translated from Hebrew by scholars using the latest type of manuscripts that they had, the Jews had in their Torah, for instance. Now, when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, they were 1,000 years older than what the scholars were using to create the Old Testament. So today, within our Old Testament, there are some changes that have been made as a result of the Dead Sea Scroll. Nothing earth-shattering, nothing bad, but they have influenced now the translators of today. So that was 1,000 years. Joe has a question.
Were any of those items
repeated? Like so many Isaiahs, were there like 2 copies?
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah, there were like 30 copies of Isaiah. And and what they find, again, like I say, it's like I would be up here reading to you from a scroll. you would be writing down a copy of that, as I read. Marilyn,
This is sort of a dumb question, but
there are no dumb questions.
where did they get the copper to make a copper scroll? I mean, they must have had a very advanced scientific existence to have copper mines someplace and
There-
pound out
Yeah,
thin copper and then write on it. So
Yeah.
that's my question.
That's-
Where did the
they-
copper come from?
I have no idea. Somewhere up in those hills, they discovered some copper that they could bring down, pound it out, work on it level, and then when you're done with it, because they didn't want anybody to know where those temple jewels and money were. So once you roll it up, even then you might have trouble unrolling it.
And they knew the copper would not deteriorate.
And they knew the copper would not deteriorate, right. Any other questions? Yeah, Bob?
What went on in that part of the world that it took so long to discover these scrolls? Was it like, there was nobody living there or something?
Right, right. A very barren place. It was just a place to graze your sheep. Those sheep probably came out from Jericho, would be the closest place. Shepherds at that point, the Bedouin shepherds, they'd contract with people to watch their sheep and they'd mark their ears or something accordingly. And that's why they were so long in being found. They were so long in being published, 40 years, because money talks, and they felt the longer they held on to them, the more expensive they would become. But Herschel Shanks and some others helped us out there. Merle.
Looking at pictures of all of those caves that you showed, it made me think of the caves in Iran and Afghanistan.
Yes.
And I wonder how much might be hidden or have been destroyed or whatever there.
Only you can speculate on that, because it is much of the same topography and the same makeup. Anybody else? Marilyn has one more.
What religion or the Bedouins that found these things? Were they Jewish people or what are Bedouins?
Bedouins are Bedouins. They're shepherds.
So they don't have an affiliation with any religion?
They're uneducated, so that's why they thought, well, this might be worth something. Let's go in and find. And there were quite a few antiquity dealers at that point, dealing in various, King David's psalm or something like that. So they went through that. Cora?
Why did the Rockefeller Foundation fund this? I know they have money, but I mean, I was just, no.
She said, why did the Rockefeller Foundation fund that? Because they had been funding the Israel Museum at that point, and because, like any foundation, you have portions of your money designated for certain areas if someone applies for it. And a lot of it is whether you apply for it or not. So they evidently had a portion of the Rockefeller Foundation designated for antiquities. Okay. Thank you all. I hope next week that you'll bring your Bibles and look as we go through the last 4 chapters of the book of Revelation. I think you'll find it exciting, interesting, and if any of you want to know what happened in the first 16, 17 chapters, I still have some of my books up here in front.